wife, Dora Holly, and our friend Dave Berman here with us. I have Tara Down, my wife.
Do we have any visiting Rotarians? Any visiting Rotarians at all? Okay. Well, let me pass out or pass around the fine basket. And I thought I'd follow up with regard to literature. I was inspired by our distinguished professor and our esteemed Rotary colleague in the book that she has written that was mentioned a week or two ago. Also inspired by Freddie in terms of history, and Jim Hebner, and he'll figure out what it is at the end. So I'm just going to introduce to you and commend for your reading a couple of books. First one, Codename Blue Wren, came out at the beginning of 2023. It's the story of Ana Montes, considered the most dangerous female spy that the United States has suffered. She's on par with Robert Hansen at the FBI and Aldrich Ames at the CIA. She spied for Cuba for 16 years, working for the Defense Intelligence Agency.
Book. Let me see the book.
Oh.
Thank you.
This is also show and tell. She spied for the DIA. As an employee of the DIA, she received every major award in the intelligence community. Most people were not aware of her. She was apprehended 10 days after 9/11. And so the story was buried in the midsection of the New York Times. What's interesting for me is the woman who recruited her was an attorney at USAID. I had the privilege and honor to be the general counsel at USAID, and she left before I arrived. She was stationed in South America. She recruited Ana Montes, and when Montes was sentenced to 25 years, Marta Velasquez fled to Sweden. I'll let you read as to what happened as the two of them. Montes came out of a family in which her sister was an FBI agent, her brother-in-law was an FBI agent, her father was a surgeon for the United States Army. Then a book that some of you may have read, it's certainly been on the New York Times bestsellers list, David Brooks' book, How to Know a Person. How to connect with somebody more deeply than you normally do. I think in part was prompted by his continuing friendship with a childhood friend into adulthood. His friend suffered depression. He thought he was assisting by encouraging. His friend took his own life. What David realized was that with even the best intentions, he had not been there for his friend. Some of you watch PBS. He's on PBS, I think it's 7 o'clock down here. Another book, The Spy Who Knew Too Much. This is a true story. This is about an intelligence officer at the CIA who tried to persuade management that there was a mole in the senior management of the CIA. He retired, came back to try to find and identify the mole. I won't tell you what happens. It's a surprise ending. It's a true story. Part of it was reported by the Washington Post. Another book is A Woman of No Importance by Catherine Belton. The story of Virginia Hall, who set up the Allied spy network in France. She now has a statue of herself in the main building, CIA in Langley. And the final one is, remember our friend Frank Bruni, who spoke with us, I think now 2 years ago, on The Beauty of Dusk. He now has a new book. A new book is dropping at the end of this month, specifically April 30th, called The Age of Grievance. And I'm pre-ordered that book, and perhaps our speakers committee may consider whether we have Frank come back and speak to us, perhaps fall or next year, on his new book. So those are some things I pass along to you for reading purposes. They're all pretty well quick reads, with the exception of David Brooks's book. So I'm now going to turn it over to President Mike.
Well, did everybody get the Easter basket they wanted? If not, maybe you need to take a little look in reflection and wonder why you didn't get that Easter basket. Or it could be that a good friend of mine, I was told, caught the Easter bunny, cut him up, and used him for cut-bait fishing. That's just a story I heard. Welcome back, everybody. It's good to be back this week. We've had a couple things going on. For those of you that didn't come to our pop-up at Bricks, you missed a really good time. We had about 25 people there. It was a lot of fun. We have another event coming up this month. It's a Rotary night at Carolina Baseball coming up April 16th. We have got the box section there on the first base side. It's family friendly. Bring the kids. I think it's $13. It's $8 for the ticket, and you get a $5 food voucher. Come on out, have some fun, watch Carolina play baseball, let the kids run the ball, maybe they'll catch a baseball. We're going to have another pop-up coming up soon at a date to be determined. Keep looking out for that on your text messages. Also, the next 3 weeks, our Fine Basket is going to be for the solar project in Uganda, correct? Uganda, excuse me. Go ahead, please.
This is Nathan Thomas's project I told you about, to bring solar to schools in Uganda. So to help those kids see their homework. This is off-grid. These have no electricity, so he'll be bringing electricity to schools in Uganda. So maybe dip a little deeper into your pocket for the next 3 weeks with the Fine Basket. Thank you very much.
Anyone have any announcements or anything before we bring up Mr. Jim to introduce what I think is going to be one of the better programs we've had this year? And I'm going to get Jim Hefner to come up and introduce our speaker. Come on up, Jim.
No pressure, Ted. No pressure.
That helped a lot. Such outrageous praise. One of the better. One of the better. Okay.
We'll get some of the good ones.
Fellow Rotarians, we've got to talk for a moment. I've been asked to do this today, and it's an occupational hazard, I suppose, to be asked to speak. Some of you who've known me for a long time know I've always felt self-confident, successful. I've done a lot of things of note. Some of you may not know, younger members. There was a time when I could get in front of the microphone and tell the listeners which team had the ball and what the score was, and everyone told me how wonderful that was. And then I read Jody's biography today, and let me put it this way. For those of you who are feeling good about what you've accomplished in your life and you haven't read the biography, don't do it now. However good you're feeling about yourself. I mean, not only the biography, but the damn book. I mean, look at this. It's heavy reading. It's interestingly enough, it's also some plagiarism. And she opens the book by citing a member of the East Chapel Hill Rotary Club. Then 1,000 pages later, I mean, it's heavy, 3 pounds later. So let's just think of it this way, that rather than thinking of her as a peer, let's just think of her as like we do one of our children, because all of our children now are smarter than we are, more successful than we are, they get paid better than we do, and we're kind of proud of all of that. So in that spirit, I'm going to try to get past the notion that if you read all this, that her biography is a contribution to community psychiatry, as we all try to try to somehow find a way to live through our insufficiency. And on that silly note, I want to call to your attention today a most extraordinary human being who is going to display today that she is an extraordinary speaker, telling the extraordinary history of a city in Israel, which is drawing extraordinary attention of the world right now. With that note, please give an extraordinary welcome to Jody Magnus.
I want to walk with so can I?
Yeah, we'll get you a port.
Is that on? Yep. Now it's on.
Well, thank you for that really amazing introduction, Jim, and I feel like no pressure here or anything like that, but you know. And thank you for inviting me to talk about the topic of Jerusalem, my favorite city in the world, and also the subject of my new book. I was asked by somebody who told me not to say who it is that I should start with a funny story. So I'm going to start with a funny story about me, which is in Jerusalem. So in the middle of the 1980s, I resided at the Albright Institute of Archaeological Research in Jerusalem for 2 years while I was working on my dissertation research. Jerusalem, even though technically it's not a divided city, is a divided city. I mean, since '67, it supposedly hasn't been divided, but the east half of the city is still the Arab part, and the west half is still the Israeli part. And the Albright Institute is located in the east part of Jerusalem, just north of the Old City. And it's on the major commercial artery that runs through East Jerusalem. It's called Salahuddin Street. It goes north from the Old City. And back in the middle of the 1980s, Salahuddin Street would close down completely at sundown. So all the shops and everything, they would shutter, and it was deserted pretty much after it got dark. So one day after dinner, I went out onto the street. There's a bus stop in front of the Institute to get a bus into town. And I was standing there waiting all by myself. It was fine, it was never creepy or anything like that. But I'm standing there, and a young man in a dark overcoat with a mustache walks up to the bus stop. And so I'm just standing there. And then he comes up to me, and he goes, "Hello." And I just kind of like turn around. And then he does this. He goes like that, and he puts his hand on my arm. And I kicked him as hard as I could in the shin. And he kind of winced, and then he looks at me and he goes, "Aren't you the one who gave that archaeology lecture last week?" So it turns out I had lectured to a group from the Pontifical Biblical Institute the week before. He was one of the students. He was some Midwestern guy from the US. I guess his name was Wes, and I was like, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," you know. Anyway, a friend of mine saw him limping around campus a week later, so that's my funny story to start off with. So I'm gonna, you know, Jim was complaining about how heavy the book is, because Jerusalem is a very complex story. It's got a lot of history, a lot of archaeology, and I wanted to tell this story in a way that would communicate that complexity, but also in an interesting and comprehensible way to people like you, who are not necessarily specialists, but are interested and educated and able to appreciate this. So I'm going to boil it down here in my talk to focus on answering a question that I was asked to answer in 2010 when I worked as a consultant for and ultimately was featured in a giant screen National Geographic film called Jerusalem, which is narrated by Benedict Cumberbatch, who I never met. But during the course of the 5 years that I was working with them on the production of this film, I was repeatedly asked to answer the question, what makes Jerusalem special? And what it really boils down to is that Jerusalem is special because it comes to be considered the place where the presence of the God of Israel dwells and where the last judgment will take place. And of course, for followers of the three Abrahamic faiths, this is a central core belief, and that really is what makes Jerusalem special, because otherwise Jerusalem is just a poor mountain city, isolated. Even until today, it's the poorest city in Israel. So just like other mountain towns, it really doesn't have a lot of natural resources. It's not on major trade routes. It's not on any waterways or anything like that. But what I want to talk about is how Jerusalem comes to be considered the place where the presence of the God of Israel dwells, and the last judgment will take place. So to get to this, we have to go really far back in history to around 1200 BCE, and just as a little aside here, I'm using BCE and CE instead of BC and AD. I don't really care, it's not a theological statement. Sometimes I use BCE, sometimes I use AD instead of BCE and CE. For those of you who don't know, by the way, BCE is before the Common Era or before the Christian Era. CE is Christian Era or Common Era. For people who don't want to use the Christian terms, before Christ and in the year of our Lord, Anno Domini, which is AD, right? So it's just more neutral terminology, but I don't really, it's not, I don't really have a big investment. But here I'm using BCE and CE. So our story starts in about 1200 BCE, when, according to the Hebrew Bible, the biblical account, the Israelite tribes entered Canaan, the land of the Canaanites, and settled down. And now I'm going to do another little qualification, and I said according to the biblical account, because here what we're going to be doing in large part is following the story as it's presented in the Hebrew Bible, which many of you would call the Old Testament, which is not an historical document, even if it might contain some historical information. So I'm not going to go through and try and evaluate which pieces of information here are true, or are historical, or are supported by archaeology or not. I'm just going to, because we don't have time, so I'm going to do that. All right, so about 1200 BCE, the Israelite tribes settled in Canaan. The way the biblical account describes it, they settled in different parts of the country, and I have that map for you here. Now, who were these Israelite tribes? So I know you're all familiar with the story of the Exodus from Egypt. I have to break your hearts and tell you that the overwhelming majority of scholars and archaeologists do not believe that the story of the Exodus is historical, and not even necessarily that it has a kernel of historical truth in it. At the very most, some of the more conservative archaeologists might agree that small groups of people left Egypt at around that time, and eventually came to settle in the country. But basically the story, the way that we look at it as scholars and archaeologists, is that somewhere around 1200 BC, groups of people coming from the direction of the south and the east entered the country, settled in the interior part of the country, which is very hilly and mountainous, and eventually became known as Israelites, because they worshipped as their chief deity a god who then becomes known as the God of Israel. This national deity or chief deity is known by the Hebrew acronym Yahweh, which is written like this if we transliterate it from Hebrew into English. And so their country becomes known as Israel, the land of Israel. Their chief deity is the God of Israel, and they therefore are the Israelites, right? So this is where our story starts. Now, eventually, those 12 tribes coalesced together, decided to choose a king to rule over them, and became a kingdom, what we call the United Kingdom or the United Monarchy. This starts, of course, with Saul, and then we get David, and then we get David's son Solomon. And when these tribes initially settled in the country in about 1200 BC, they settled the interior part of the country, but Jerusalem, let me just go back here, Jerusalem, which is located in the heart of the hill country, did not fall under the rule of the Israelites at that time. This was a non-Israelite city. It was strongly enough fortified, apparently, that the Israelites were unable to take it. And so it's not until 200 years later that after the Israelites form a kingdom, that David is able to take Jerusalem from the native inhabitants, and he then makes Jerusalem the political and religious capital of his kingdom. And he makes it the political capital by building a palace for himself there, and he makes it the religious capital of his kingdom by bringing the presence of the God of Israel, which had wandered around with the Israelites in the wilderness in an ark, in a portable container, he brings that ark to Jerusalem and places it on top of a rocky outcrop overlooking the city. Now here in the slide, you're looking at an aerial view of the city of Jerusalem, focusing on the old city. And I hate these kind of screens, by the way, because I like having one big screen, so when I point, everybody's looking at the same screen. And also with these kinds of screens, they swallow the pointer. You can't use a pointer on these screens. Okay, so here we're looking at the south wall of the old city. There's the Temple Mount here. And what I want to highlight for you is that the city of Jerusalem that David conquered was located here, to the south of the Temple Mount. That's an area that we call the City of David, because that was the city of Jerusalem that David conquered in about 1000 BC. So David brings the Ark of the Covenant, which I've been wandering around, to Jerusalem, and he plunks it down on top of a rocky outcrop to the north of the city that overlooks the city, and that rocky outcrop is what eventually comes to be known as the Temple Mount. When David died, he was succeeded by his son Solomon, and his son Solomon then expands the city to the north to include this area of the Temple Mount, where he builds a new palace for himself and also a permanent home for the God of Israel in the form of a temple, the first temple, or Solomon's temple. And here, I like this view a lot because what you're looking at here is in the foreground at the bottom of the slide, the area going down into the city of David. And then as you go north, you can see the bedrock rises to the area of the Temple Mount. And so, from the time of David and Solomon, the Temple Mount became the acropolis of the city of Jerusalem, meaning a natural high point on which the most important religious and political buildings were located, and it served as that throughout time. And so Solomon builds this first temple. This first temple stands until 586 BCE, when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians and the inhabitants are sent into exile in Babylonia. This is a reconstruction showing the temple on top of the Temple Mount of what Solomon's temple might have looked like. On top of the Temple Mount, you see it all the way there to the right at the top. And then as you move down, the next complex of buildings is Solomon's palace. And then you come down here to the area of the city of David, right? So that gives you a good impression of that. That first temple then is destroyed in 586 BC. There's no temple on the Temple Mount for approximately 65 years after that. And then subsequently, under Persian rule, the inhabitants of Jerusalem and the rest of the country who had been exiled to Babylonia in 586 BC were allowed to return. And they then are given permission by the Persian king, Cyrus, which, by the way, has modern political resonances that I will not go into. But they are given permission by Cyrus to rebuild the temple on the Temple Mount, in the spot where the original first temple had been located. And this second temple then starts a period that we call the Second Temple period. It's consecrated in 516 BCE. That temple stood until 70 AD, 70 CE, when it was destroyed by the Romans at the time of the first Jewish revolt against the Romans. So what you see here is a model of Jerusalem that exists in Jerusalem. It's on the grounds of the Israel Museum, called the Holy Land model. And what you see is their reconstruction of the temple sitting in the middle of a large open paved space, that is the Temple Mount, as it looked after King Herod the Great rebuilt the temple and the Temple Mount in the 1st century BCE. So that's what it's showing you here. So all of this, now we've talked about the first temple, the second temple. So first of all, what is a temple? And I want to explain that a temple is not a church, is not a synagogue, is not a mosque. There is a very, I think, unfortunate custom of referring particularly to synagogues today, or at least to some synagogues, as a temple. But never was the temple a synagogue, and never was a synagogue a temple. They are completely, in fact, they're diametrically opposed from each other in terms of what their function is. To understand this, you have to understand what a temple was in antiquity and how ancient peoples, not just Jews, not just Israelites, but all ancient peoples, how they interacted with their gods and goddesses. So the way that it worked was this. Today, by the way, if you go to church or synagogue or a mosque, right, those are congregational halls for prayer and worship. And you go in and you believe that if you pray, you are in communion with God, right? You also will believe, probably, if you believe in God, that God is omnipresent, that he's everywhere all the time, and that you can freely, interact with God whenever you want. That's not what ancient peoples thought. In the minds of ancient peoples, gods did not, and this is true also, and I'm going to talk about all ancient peoples, but it's true also of the Israelites and the Jews. In the minds of ancient peoples, gods did not dwell among humans. They dwelled in other places. They dwelled up in heaven, in which case they're celestial deities, or maybe like the Greek Olympian gods, they dwelled on Mount Olympus, or some of them dwelled underground. They didn't live among humans. And so if you, as a human, wanted to communicate with a god, that meant if you wanted the god to come to you and do good things for you, feed you, protect you, whatever, you had to somehow entice the god to come to you. So how did you do that? Now, the God of Israel was a celestial deity, meaning that the God of Israel is conceived of as dwelling up in heaven. So how do you get a celestial deity to come down to you and do good things for you and all of that? So what you do is you find a high point, a natural high point, that will be close to the heavens, a mountain. And if you think about interactions between people and the God of Israel over time, it's always on mountaintops. Whether it's Mount Sinai, whether it's the Temple Mount, whether it's Jesus giving the Sermon on the Mount. It's not a coincidence. You want to get as close as possible to the deity. And then on top of that mountain, you build an altar where you can offer something good to the God. You can offer sacrifices. Now, if the God's up in heaven, so what do? Well, you want to offer the most precious thing that you can get, right? So what's the most precious thing in antiquity? It's meat. Because meat was extremely expensive. People rarely ate meat in antiquity. So you would take a nice animal and you would slaughter it and you would butcher it and you would cut it into pieces and you would take some of those choice pieces of meat and burn them on the altar. And the smoke would rise up to heaven, and God up there would go, barbecue. I'm coming down to check it out. And so you now entice the God to come down, and you don't want the God to just eat and run. You want to keep him there, right? So what do? Next to the altar, you build a house for the God where the God can live. That house is a temple. Now that house, of course, because it's a house for God, has to be a really nice house, not an ordinary house. So you build a temple next to the altar, and then what you have are priestly intermediaries, priests, who are there to serve the needs of the God in his house, to keep him fed, to keep him clothed, to keep him bathed, right? And they serve as the intermediaries between the God and everybody else. And so in antiquity, most people were not allowed into the temple building because they were not allowed into the direct presence of God. And this is true also of the Jerusalem temple. They stayed outside, congregated around the altar where the sacrifices were being offered, and the priests went into the temple in order to service the needs of the God. And this is exactly the way that the Jerusalem temple operated, just like all other ancient temples. One of the differences, and I'll show this in a minute, one of the only differences between the Jerusalem temples and other ancient temples is that Israelites and later Jews came to believe that the God of Israel was so powerful that his presence could not be contained within a physical statue. But other ancient temples, of course, had statues inside that were a statue of the deity. And by the way, ancient peoples weren't stupid. They didn't think that the statue itself was the God. The statue was the container for the presence of the God, which enabled physical interaction between the people and the God. After all, how are you going to feed the God? How are you going to clothe it? How are you going to bathe it if you don't have a something physical, right? So the statue is the physical container for the presence of the God. So one of the differences is that the Jerusalem temple contained no physical statue, but conceptually, the Israelites and later the Jews believed that the presence of the God of Israel dwelled in his house on the Temple Mount, in the Jerusalem temple, right? So that's what a temple is. And notice that that's diametrically opposed to a synagogue, a church, or a mosque, which of course are congregational halls for prayer and worship. So I just mentioned that difference of the statues. So, one of the problems that I have with the way many people, including many scholars, approach the study of Judaism and antiquity, Jews and Judaism, is that they tend to look at Jews and Judaism as if they were something different and unique from everything else going on around them, when in fact they were far more like everybody else than they were different. And the differences between the Jews and everybody else in antiquity are actually pretty minor in the big picture. So you can't look at the Israelites and the Jews by divorcing them and thinking that they're different from everybody else. But I do want to mention these differences. So what are some of these differences? Well, eventually, Jews came to believe that there could be only one temple dedicated to the God of Israel, and it had to be on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Of course, other gods were worshipped in many temples, so there were many temples of Zeus or whatever all around the ancient world, and that was not true of the God of Israel, although I have to say, by the way, that it's actually not true, because there were other temples dedicated to the God of Israel outside of Jerusalem. You just never hear about them. But there were. Okay, so that's not even really a difference. It comes to be perceived as a difference, but it's not really. Another difference is that the Jews worshipped only one God. Now, a lot of times these Israelites and early Jews are referred to as monotheistic. Hate to break it to you, they were not monotheistic. The Israelites, when they first come into the country and settle down, they in fact were polytheistic, just like everybody else. Everyone in the ancient world worshipped many different gods and goddesses, and but typically each people, or sometimes the city, would have one chief deity or one national deity who they worshipped as their special protector above all others. And the best example I can give is Athens, where, which of course is named after their patron deity Athena, but the people of Athens, of course, worship many different gods and goddesses alongside Athena. And so it was with the Israelites. When they originally come in, they come to be known as Israelites because they worship the God of Israel as their chief deity, but they did worship other gods and goddesses alongside the God of Israel, and we have both evidence in the Hebrew Bible itself and in archaeology that indicates this, so I'm not just making that up. Now what happens is, over time, some Israelites, and later all Jews, came to believe that the God of Israel was a jealous God who would not tolerate the worship of other gods alongside him. And by the way, this is a very dicey thing to do in antiquity. If you believe that there are all these gods and goddesses out there, you're taking a real risk if you ignore them, because they could do bad things to you. So the only way that you would abandon the worship of other gods and goddesses and worship only the God of Israel is if you believe, you're convinced, that he is so powerful that he can protect you from the wrath of other gods. That is the view that eventually won over, but it took centuries until, all Jews came to believe that, and even when all Jews came to believe that, they still weren't monotheistic, they were monolatrous. Monotheism is the belief that only one God exists. Monolatry is the worship of one God while not denying the existence of other gods. And by the way, think of the second commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. Well, that makes no sense if there are no other gods. Why would God even say that? Right? So we have lots of evidence to indicate this. So for a very long time, what the Jews were eventually was monolatrous, but they weren't monotheistic. So the worship of only one God distinguishes them, but they weren't monotheistic. That's a kind of a later development. And as I said, there's no physical depiction, no cult statue in the Jerusalem temple, so that's the difference. But again, the concept is the same, that God dwells inside his temple. Here I have, by the way, these are wonderful. These are pictures from India. Some of you may recognize this, and I love going to India because in Hinduism, the way Hindus worship their gods is similar in many ways to this. So on the right, you see a depiction of a goddess who is literally clothed and given her attributes. And this is the way ancient statues in the ancient world were venerated, right? They would be worshipped like this, and they were clothed. And we think of those beautiful Greek statues of white marble, but they weren't white marble. They were actually polychrome painted in gaudy, what we would think of as gaudy colors, and they would have been clothed, and we know that anyway. And then on the other photograph shows you this sort of interior of a temple. So you see the worshiper who's sitting outside, right? And the statue of the god is inside, and there you see in the innermost room the priests who are attending to the needs of the god. So again, this is the kind of interaction that you would have to visualize. And all of this is important, by the way, because we're talking here also about the time of Jesus. So if you want to imagine the world of Jesus, this is what we're talking about. And I say that if you want to imagine what the world of Jesus was like in terms of the way people interacted with their deities, go to India, by the way, not to North America. Another difference between Judaism and most other ancient religions is that it had a priestly caste system. And so here, basically, according to biblical law, you had to be born into a priestly family, and only adult men could serve as priests. But you had to be born into a priestly family to be allowed to serve as a priest. Whereas in most other ancient religions, you could donate money and serve as a priest. So if you had enough money and you wanted to, and even sometimes women, you could serve as a priestess. This was not the case in ancient Judaism, even until today. And again, this is a little bit similar, interestingly, to India with the caste system. There's kind of some, I'm not saying a connection, but it's a kind of a parallel. And by the way, today, Judaism still preserves the caste system through names. It comes through the father. And so the word for priest in Hebrew is Cohen, C-O-H-E-N. So anybody whose last name is Cohen, or some variation thereof, Cohen or whatever, is a descendant of the Jewish priestly families. And likewise, the Levites, who were the attendants who served with the priests in the temple, their ancestry is traced as well. So anybody today who's named Levine or Levi or anything like that, they're descended from a Levitical family, from one of those Levite families. And everybody else is just Israel. All the others are mushed together. And the other thing that distinguished ancient Judaism from most other religions is that it had a corpus of written laws, right? And these are the laws that are in the 5 books of Moses. And that basically is what enabled Judaism to survive as a religion, even after the temple was destroyed and it no longer became possible to worship God through a sacrificial cult in the Jerusalem temple. So in 70 CE, the Jerusalem temple was destroyed together with the rest of the city by the Romans. And what happens then is that there's a period of about, again, 60 to 65 years when the city of Jerusalem lies in ruins. It's pretty much desolate. And then, around 135 or so, the Roman Emperor Hadrian rebuilds the city of Jerusalem, but rebuilds it not as a Jewish city, but as a pagan Roman city. And he gives it a new name, Aelia Capitolina. Aelia is his middle name, Publius Aelius Hadrianus. Capitolina refers to the new chief deity of the city. It's no longer a Jewish city. The new chief deity of the city is going to be the chief deity of the Romans, Capitoline Jupiter, so Aelia Capitolina. And he apparently builds some sort of a temple or shrine dedicated to Jupiter on top of the Temple Mount. And whatever was there, temple or shrine or whatever, the archaeological evidence is pretty scarce, but whatever was there on the Temple Mount then was there until we get to 313, or the years after 313 AD, when Christianity was made legal, a legal religion in the Roman Empire. Subsequently became the religion of the emperor himself, and then we get into the time of Constantine, and subsequently became the official religion of the Roman Empire. And once we enter this period, the Byzantine period or the early Christian period, once this happens, whatever pagan shrine or temple to Jupiter that was on the Temple Mount, that was certainly taken down, would have been torn down. And subsequently, for the duration of this period when Jerusalem is under Christian rule, subsequently, the Temple Mount remains in ruins. The Christians left the Temple Mount lying in ruins deliberately because they saw it as a visual fulfillment of Jesus's prediction that the temple would be destroyed, and as a visual testimony to the triumph of Christianity over Judaism. So for these centuries, the Temple Mount was in ruins and it was used as a garbage dump. And whatever building pieces were lying around there in ruins would have been pulled out and rebuilt into other buildings in the area. What happens under the Christians then is that the focal point of the city moves a short distance from the Temple Mount to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which I've pointed out to you here, and which you can also see here. So you see the proximity between the two, because of course Constantine, already he was the first Roman emperor. He's the one who legalized Christianity, right? And he also is the first Christian emperor, although he wasn't baptized until he was on his deathbed. But anyway, he builds the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to enshrine the spots where it is believed Jesus was crucified and buried. And so the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, under Christian rule, basically replaces the Temple Mount as the spot where you have the interaction between God and his people. That becomes the new focal point, but again, removed from the Temple Mount a short distance away. And this is an ancient mosaic map called the Madaba map, which shows the city of Jerusalem at the height of the early Christian period. I've encircled for you there the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but what's really interesting is that this map doesn't show the Temple Mount at all. Because for the Christians, the Temple Mount had no longer any significance. In the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, they appropriated a lot of the associations with the temple. And so the fact that the Temple Mount is lying in ruins no longer has any importance for Christians. Therefore, it's not represented in this map of the city. At the same time, by the way, what's happening with the Jews did not give up hope of rebuilding the temple. The Jews always looked forward to rebuilding the temple. In the minds of Jews, Christ did not substitute for the sacrifices in the temple. He was not the Messiah. The Jews looked forward to the rebuilding of the temple eventually, and ancient synagogues from this period are filled with images alluding to the Jerusalem temple and alluding to the Jewish hopes for the eventual rebuilding of the temple. And so, in the 7th century, when Jerusalem was conquered by the Muslims, and here we're now, Jerusalem actually surrenders to the Muslims somewhere around 638 AD or CE. What happens then is that the focus now shifts back to the Temple Mount, which remember had been in ruins for centuries and was basically covered with garbage. And it was under the first Muslim dynasty, the Umayyads, that the Temple Mount was rebuilt. They cleared away the garbage. They re-exposed a rocky outcrop in the middle of the Temple Mount, apparently where the temple had been located, what is called the foundation stone, and enshrined it within a building, and here's a view of the Temple Mount, enshrined it within a building that is the Dome of the Rock, right? That rocky outcrop, that's the rock inside the Dome of the Rock. And this actually was understood by these early Muslims as being yet another iteration of the Temple of Solomon. In other words, in their minds, it's the Temple of Solomon rebuilt. The Umayyad ruler who built it is seen as a kind of in the line of David and Solomon, right, rebuilding the temple. And the message is that Muhammad, their prophet, is in the line of the earlier Old Testament prophets, but also, by the way, Jesus, who Muslims accept as a prophet. And so he is the final prophet, and all of this to show that Islam then is the fulfillment of all of the hopes and expectations that were associated with the original temple, including, by the way, the idea that this is where God is going to pronounce his final judgment. And so you see here the Dome of the Rock, again with the gold dome in the middle of the Temple Mount. At the south end of the Temple Mount, a little bit off the slide, is a monument with a silver dome called Al-Aqsa Mosque. And these are two very different buildings. The Dome of the Rock is a monument to enshrine that rocky outcrop. Eventually, in Islam, that rocky outcrop comes to be associated with a passage in the Quran that describes Muhammad's night journey, his Isra. And according to this, Muhammad in his night journey travels from Mecca to a place called the farthest mosque, Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, and then from there meets with the Old Testament prophets. And what happens is that Islamic tradition comes to associate or identify the furthest mosque with Jerusalem's Temple Mount, and that rocky outcrop at a later point becomes identified as the spot from which Muhammad ascended to heaven. Right, so all of that becomes localized very potently on this spot, and the Dome of the Rock, therefore, is not a mosque. It's not a congregational hall of prayer and worship. It is a monument that enshrines that rocky outcrop with its very potent traditions associated with it. The mosque, the congregational hall for prayer and worship on the Temple Mount, is Al-Aqsa Mosque, which was built around the same time, a tiny bit later, than the Dome of the Rock. And I know all of you, well, most of you are old enough to remember when Sadat visited Jerusalem in 1977. I was in Jerusalem at the time, and if you recall that event, when he went to pray, he prayed not inside the Dome of the Rock, he prayed in Al-Aqsa Mosque. right? That's the congregational hall for prayer and worship. So people do pray in the Dome of the Rock, but it's individual prayer. It's not congregational prayer, right? And by the way, nowadays, the Temple Mount would be referred to in Arabic either as the noble or sacred enclosure, Al-Haram al-Sharif, or sometimes the term Al-Aqsa is referred to the entire Temple Mount, used to refer to the entire Temple Mount and not just at the congregational hall at the south end of it. So here you see the Dome of the Rock. We actually know exactly when it was built because there is a dedicatory inscription inside that gives the date. And so we know it's built 691, 692 CE by one of the Umayyad caliphs, Abd al-Malik. The outside of the building, most of it has been redone since antiquity, but the building itself has stood since the 7th century. It's actually the earliest fully standing surviving Muslim monument anywhere in the world. It's extremely important. And the interior, however, still preserves most of its original decoration. And here I just show you a couple of views of the interior to give, we could have a whole nother talk about that, but I'm going to not go on about that. And so now I want to come back to this area of the Temple Mount and its sanctity. And you can see here the Dome of the Rock on top of the Temple Mount. The entire Temple Mount platform is surrounded by an enclosure wall that was built when Herod the Great rebuilt and expanded the temple and the Temple Mount in the 1st century BC. And today, for Jews, the most sacred spot is part of that enclosure wall, what's called the Western Wall or Wailing Wall. It's called the Western Wall because it's part of the western side along the Temple Mount. But it is not part of the temple. A lot of times you read that this is the last surviving remnant of the temple. It is not. It's just part of the wall around the Temple Mount. The temple building itself would have stood on top of the Temple Mount, roughly where the Dome of the Rock is today. But to show you that this notion that the God of Israel, that the presence of the God of Israel still dwells here, I end with this slide, which I took from a newspaper article about 10 years ago, where you see it's captioned, Western Wall employees remove messages and prayers written by thousands of people addressed to God from the cracks in the Western Wall on August 25th, 2013 in Jerusalem. All the notes once collected will be buried in a special place on the Mount of Olives. And so Jews who come to pray now at the Western Wall write little prayers, little messages to God on pieces of paper and stick them in the cracks of the Western Wall because they believe that's the closest you can get to the presence of the God of Israel so that he will hear your prayer. So this idea that this is still the place where the presence of the God of Israel is, and that's the closest that you can get, that is still an idea, a belief that is very much alive. So I'm going to stop there. I'll be happy to take questions if there are questions or time. Thank you.
I've got two questions for you. That was absolutely wonderful. One I think you can dispose of quickly, the other a little more time. But my Irish grandfather used to always maintain that now your picture of St. Patrick holding a banjo there reminded me, the green figure you had holding a banjo. It made me think of St. Patrick with a banjo. And my grandfather always maintained that the Irish were the lost tribe of Israel.
Well, that picture was from India, so maybe, who knows, maybe the Irish also made it to India. But
the serious question is, whatever happened to the Ark of the Covenant?
Yeah, the Ark of the Covenant, and thank you for asking, because I did mean to mention this as well. So what exactly is the Ark of the Covenant? So the Ark of the Covenant was a container, a chest, that according to the biblical account, contained the tablets of the Ten Commandments. When the Israelites, after the Exodus, were wandering around in the desert for 40 years, right, they wanted to be protected by God, but because they're wandering around, they couldn't build a temple, right? They didn't have a permanent temple building. So what did they do? They carried this chest with their most precious sacred objects in it around with them, and when they would camp, they would build a special sort of temporary temple called the tabernacle, which was basically a tent. And they would put the container, the ark, into the tent, and the ark then conceptually served for them as the footstool of the God of Israel. So literally they thought that the God the God of Israel was enthroned and seated on the throne on top of the ark, and his feet rested on top of the ark. And so for them, conceptually, that was the way that they had the presence of the God of Israel accompanying them to protect them as they wandered around in the wilderness. And that ends, of course, when Solomon builds the temple, and then subsequently the ark is put into the innermost room in the temple. The ark disappeared in 586 BC when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians. It was destroyed and taken away and subsequently disappeared, and we don't know where it ended up. And the search for the ark is not an archaeological question, as I like to say, not something archaeologists are interested in. The only people who look for the ark are not professional archaeologists. I'd be happy to say more about that if you want, but anyway, I will just say that. Okay, yeah.
Explain to me the Dome of the Rock inside looks like a congregational gathering place.
Yeah.
Why is that
Right.
if that was not the case?
Yes, so it's not actually a congregational gathering place. So, okay, so if you look at the difference in the layout, so a church, a basilica, right, or a synagogue or a mosque are elongated halls with lots of columns inside to support the roof, with a focal point at one narrow end where you have an altar for the Eucharist if you're Christian, or the Torah shrine if you're Jewish, or the mihrab, the niche in the direction of Mecca if you're Muslim. But you have at the one end of the hall a focal point, and the people congregate inside. That the hall is intended to accommodate, congregations of people who then are whose attention is directed towards that focal point, right? That's the idea of a congregational hall of prayer and worship. This building is not that. It is what is called a centralized building. A centralized building is a building that either is octagonal or polygonal. This is octagonal, polygonal or circular, that has a focal point in the center, and that is intended to facilitate pilgrimage to that central focal point. Literally, that pilgrims would come and circumambulate, walk around that central focal point. In this case, it's the foundation stone. I'll give you another couple of analogies that very similar in size, in decoration, and in layout, except that it's circular and not octagonal, is the rotunda of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built by Constantine, has a basilica, but at the other end, it has a circular dome structure called the rotunda, which enshrines the tomb of Christ, right? And that's in the middle. Another example, also built by Constantine, in Bethlehem, the Church of the Nativity, where you have, again, built by Constantine, rebuilt by Justinian, but anyway, you have the basilica. And then at one end, you have a centralized structure. Originally, it was octagonal, built by Constantine, in the center of which is the cave venerated as the spot where Jesus was born. So there are two different building types, and so this is not designed as a congregational hall for prayer and worship. That again is Al-Aqsa Mosque. And it's very interesting that you have here a pairing which mirrors what you have at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The congregational hall, which is a basilica, which is Al-Aqsa Mosque, right, to serve those needs. And then you have in the case of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the rotunda. Here you have the Dome of the Rock, which are enshrining these central focal points. So there's definitely a parallelism there. Yep, all the way in the back. Yeah, yep.
Hi. So the Al-Aqsa Mosque was never a place for Jewish worship, was it?
No, the Al-Aqsa Mosque was never, the mosque itself was, no, the Al-Aqsa Mosque was not a place for Jewish prayer and worship. Now there's a whole other thing, if you're interested you can read the book for the details, but there's a whole other thing because there's a question about, there are references in early Islamic literature to the caliph, the Muslim caliph. He wasn't Umayyad, this is pre-Umayyad. When Muhammad died, he was succeeded by 4 elected caliphs. And the one who oversaw the surrender of Jerusalem to the Muslims, Jerusalem was not besieged by the Muslims. It surrendered peacefully, it was not destroyed by the Muslims. And there's a question about exactly what date that occurred, but at any rate, the caliph who oversaw Jerusalem's surrender was a guy named Omar. And there are references to a Mosque of Omar, to Christians when Omar enters the city, offering to have him come and worship in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and he apparently, turned that down. And he may then have worshipped on the Temple Mount, and then there are these references to a mosque of Omar. And was that in the place where Al-Aqsa Mosque was later built? We don't know. We don't have remains. How big was it? But it was never. There was never any. The mosque itself was never a place of Jewish worship, right? The temple. The Temple Mount, of course, was always sacred to Jews, but that's different.
The problem for present day Israel is not that the Al-Aqsa Mosque should be a place where they have a right to go, it's the whole Temple Mount.
Right, so the dispute today, and it's not even that much of a dispute, by the way. So the Temple Mount, so I don't really want to go into modern politics, because, we'll never get out of that. But from a technical point of view, the authority, and this is, a lot of these arrangements, at all of these religious sites are arrangements that go back decades. And nobody wants to change them. Everybody wants to keep the status quo, because if you change stuff, you're going to start having, problems breaking out. So the arrangement is that the Temple Mount is under the authority of the Waqf. The Waqf is the Muslim religious authority. They are the ones who have authority over the Temple Mount. That's been the case since the Temple Mount was still under Jordanian rule before 1967. The Israelis do not have control of the Temple Mount. They do not. And so anything that's done, I'm not allowed onto the Temple Mount, by the way. So yeah, anything that's done up there has to be done with the permission of the Waqf. And whatever work was done in recent years under Al-Aqsa Mosque, where they've been clearing out debris and all, that was done because of the Waqf, without any archaeological supervision and without any Israeli intervention. So that's the kind of short answer to that, right? But yes, would Israelis like to be able to go, or Jews, to go up and, anyway, that's a different thing.
All right, thank you.
And I see Mike's getting up here, because we have one more question, he said. Yeah.
Can you hear me? We think about, you mentioned the Pentateuch. Now, when was it codified and became part of, was it part of the Ark? Or what we know of is the
Right.
Old Testament Bible.
Right, okay, well, wow, okay, so ending with the world's biggest question. And so let me first distinguish and say, you first said Pentateuch and then you said Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, so they're different things, right? So if you open up a Bible, anybody's Bible, the first 5 books in it are the 5 books of Moses, or in Greek called the Pentateuch, right? Or what Jews call the Torah, right? And those contain the laws the Jews believe God gave his people, right? And then you have the rest of the books of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible that follow, and which books are included and which are not, depend on whether you're using a Hebrew Bible or a Catholic Bible or a Protestant Bible or whatever. So there's no agreement among scholars about when those books were composed and edited and written down. There is, however, no doubt that the process of writing down and composition and editing and revising, this took place over the course of many centuries and was carried out by many different groups of men. I always tell my students, sorry, it was men, but it was men. So over the course of the centuries by different groups of men. So if you look at any one book, right, the question is, so when is the earliest? I think a conservative estimate would be that by, let's say, the 8th, 7th centuries BC, the first books were already being written down for the first time. The first 5 books, right, were in some form, but not all of them necessarily. I mean, probably the earlier books like, Genesis and Exodus or whatever. Some scholars would put that earlier, even maybe back into the 9th century. Some would say even earlier. I don't think that's possible, but some say later because there's no agreement. And then going through the rest of the books of the Hebrew Bible till you get to the latest one, which is the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel was actually composed at the time of the Maccabean revolt in the middle of the 2nd century BC. That's the last book that was composed. But they're all written down and edited and re-edited over the course of time. And I do have some discussion of that. It's not focused on that, but in my book to sort of set the stage for understanding Jerusalem. Thank you.
Thank you. Everybody have a great weekend. We have another big hitter next week. Oh, also the pictures on the wall are for sale. They're help to. If you're interested, please talk to the folks here about that. Thank you. Everybody have a great weekend. Don't pull for state.
I'm not going to be able to it doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that.
What's it called? I'm just looking at it.
No, that.
Pretty acres, okay.
Well, I'm not going to be doing it for
All right, I got to memorize the name of it. No, I got to get a copy though.
we brought
Jim's
that.
copy, I know.